Welcome to Theology Sabbath School from week 2 of the lockdown. And it does seem kind of serious to think about it. We are at a different location than we were last time. We're trying to be able to practice some more social distancing than we were at our last Sabbath School together. But seriously, welcome. We're glad that you can join us for Theology Sabbath School. And it is week 2 for us of the church not being open, Sabbath School not being able to meet, and so we're really glad we can spend the time to talk about today's lesson, the second to the last lesson of our quarterly on the book of Daniel, which takes us to a rather challenging chapter in the book of Daniel, and that's Daniel chapter 11. And our lesson is entitled From North and South to the Beautiful Land. And it's a privilege to have Dr. Dave Thomas, who's our lead teacher, with us today. He's actually just written an article in Spectrum Magazine, which you might want to check out also on Daniel chapter 11.
Yes.
SpectrumMagazine.com or something like that, or .org.
It's a Sabbath School commentary for the day.
Yeah, so you might want to check that out online. And then Dr. Matilda Fry, whose background is in the Old Testament, and of course she was with us last week when we talked about Daniel chapter 10. So thank you, both of you, for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you, Dave.
Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome. I thought I would begin this lesson with a little bit of a personal reflection. You know, when I went to college, I studied theology. I put myself on a track to pastoral ministry, and I worked for nearly 25 years in a pastoral setting. I never fancied myself to be a biblical scholar, and I am not a master of ancient languages or ancient history. I know a lot more about systematic theology and about pastoral work than I do about technical biblical textual analysis. So I find it very interesting that this morning I am to lead a study of, as Carl mentioned, one of the most obscure or challenging chapters in the whole Bible. I'm very happy to have Matilda here. I didn't know she would be part of this commentary when I first set out to do this lesson, but Daniel chapter 11 is widely regarded by a lot of people as the most obscure chapter, and if you read widely about Daniel 11, you'll find a whole lot of different theories that range from, I think of some who want to see it as something that is tied basically back to the Persian Empire and focuses finally on Antiochus Epiphanes and his overtaking of Jerusalem and the sacrifices he did there, something that's pretty well known in biblical studies. Other people, more interestingly, even see this as a progression that includes radical Islam. Some of you may have read some of the work of one of the Adventist pastors in the Idaho Conference, Tim Rosenberg, who has been doing a lot of work on Daniel 11 and sees a link from the papacy to Islam, and he's even written some books on it, which I find very interesting because those of you who know your Adventist history know that early on in Adventist eschatology, the Ottoman Empire was thought to be a major player, and when that all collapsed kind of suddenly, people had to start rethinking the eschatology, and the whole question of Islam disappeared. Another comment I want to make is that I think the best way to look at this chapter is to look at it from what I call the 35,000 foot level. If you look at all the details, in fact, we were talking, and Matilda, I loved what you said before we started our lesson here, that every time you read this chapter, what happens?
Well, I read it this morning, and I felt, as I read through it, verse by verse, in the Hebrew language, almost word by word, I felt like every time you have the impression that you understand something, the very next sentence, the very next text takes you to something very different. So it slips out of our hands as we go throughout the entire chapter.
Yeah, it's almost like I said. It's almost like it's, well, where I grew up, there were these little animals. These little I don't know what they are. They're chameleons. They change color, and it looks like every time you read this, you think, oh, this looks clear, and then it changes. But I want to make the reflection that it's interesting to me when you look at the book of Daniel that many of the chapters in the book are standalone chapters. Like chapter 1 has a story, it doesn't rely on much else. Chapter 2 is a story, chapter 3, chapter 4. When you get to chapter 7, you no longer have standalone chapters. You have 7, 8, and 9 that go together. And I think it's important when looking at chapter 11 to understand it doesn't stand by itself. It's part of a progression that involves chapters 10, 11, and 12. And so I don't think anybody should look at this chapter all by itself. You have to realize that it's part of a story that plays out over 3 chapters. The other thing I think is interesting, and then I want to invite Carl and Matilda to jump in here, is another thing that I find interesting is that if you look at the prophetic sequence that's laid out so clearly in Daniel chapter 2 and you follow it through the book, it seems to me that the focal point of that progression moves with history. For example, in chapter 2, the focus is primarily on Babylon. All the discussion is about Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, this is your kingdom. Mm-hmm. Others will follow, but the primary focus is on Babylon and maybe Medo-Persia. When you get to 7, 8, and 9, it's shifted kind of to Medo-Persia. I think when you get to 10, 11, and 12, it's shifted even beyond that. As history moves, I think the focus moves. But, so what do you guys want to say about this chapter? I've been jabbering away here by myself. I'd love to hear what you all think.
Well, I find it so interesting that Daniel has prayed in chapter 9. And towards the end of chapter 9, Gabriel comes back to him and says, we heard your prayer, yeah. And I come in response to that prayer. And I come to tell you the meaning of it, what it is. So from verse 24 on, he explains to him what is happening. When you transition to chapter 10, here he is in the 3rd year of King Cyrus. So we are about almost 2 years later after that, and he has another vision. At this point, Daniel has probably moved from Babylon, where he has been living to the other side of the Tigris River. And at this point, he has this vision where he falls down and is weak and sick and so on. And then he's lifted up, touched and lifted up. Many commentators see here the person who is going to explain the vision to him is again Gabriel. Mm-hmm. But the one who touches Daniel and raises him up is not Gabriel. It is a human-like being, and it is described with the garments that he wears, and it is the description of a high priestly figure. Mm-hmm. And this being raises him up, and now we come to the end of chapter 10 and into chapter 11, and finally this being, this human-like high priestly being, finally has the message. Chapter 10 was without the message of what it means.
Yeah, it was only the encounter of Daniel.
Yes. And then this high priestly being says, from the 1st year of Darius, I took a stand, and I took my stand to support and protect him. Isn't that interesting that the high priestly divine being is going to support and protect the king, the earthly king?
You know, I read this morning too,
yes.
And I underlined this in red because I thought, wait, before earlier in verse 20, it was he was going to fight against the prince of Persia,
yes.
And then now we're going back, and now he's standing up for him.
Right.
So we see again this kind of cosmic controversy aspect that plays into it.
Yes.
And I wanted to make the point that priestly-like being is also divine, and you made that point because sometimes people read that, and so this is not a human.
Yes.
It only appears to be a human who has it.
It's a visionary appearance of a human-like figure that speaks, that touches, and is clothed, but has the clothes of a high priest.
And what do you think about the confusion that Daniel experiences here over a period of time? You know, because earlier in the book he's sick. He sees this vision. He does not understand it. Mm-hmm. Now he's sick again. And by the way, I'm also intrigued by the encounter between a divine being and a human being. It always leaves the human being feeling rather disabled or discombobulated. I mean, on his face. Human arrogance does not survive an encounter with the divine being.
Yes.
But what do you think about the confusion? I have some thoughts about that, but I'd love to know what you two think. Why is Daniel confused?
I think Daniel is always confused when the vision has these creatures appearing to him that are so different from anything that we know of. A lion with wings and a leopard with 4 heads and 4 wings. These are composite mythical creatures, and they come out of the sea, of the Great Sea.
Yeah.
And when Daniel sees that, he is very confused and doesn't understand.
Yeah.
What I do find interesting after the prayer in chapter 9, that is the interpretation and the meaning of the Messiah who is to come at the end of the 70 weeks. And when this Messiah arrives, he is going to put an end to iniquity, to sin, restore the holy, and so on. And you go back to the beginning of chapter 10, and Daniel says the understanding of the message came to him. Here he understood. Now this high priest finally gives him a further part of the message, another revelation of that conflict that is happening. And I do find it interesting that we are in the first year of King Darius here, who is in the biblical book of Daniel, who is the one who initiates the release of Daniel's people to go home. So now Daniel hears that his people who go home, and 2 years later they are on their way home, here in Daniel 11. And Daniel is still in Babylon, an old man, and he needs to hear of wars and conflicts and destruction and his own people who are going to suffer through all of this. Why? Because there is a king in the north, there is a king in the south, and Daniel's people are in the middle. They are squished in between those, and they suffer. So,
which is not what Daniel would have been expecting, I think, especially based on the prophecy of Jeremiah that they would be in captivity of 70 years and be restored. And I've often wondered if Daniel's eschatology was tied to that dream. He expected after 70 years that there would be a restoration of Jerusalem, and the kingdom, the covenant kingdom, would be restored and grow to grandeur. Now this vision is talking about 70 weeks and long periods of time with a lot of turmoil, and I wonder if that didn't contribute to his confusion.
Possibly, but it did contribute to his understanding, because of that prophecy in Jeremiah chapter 29, Daniel prayed.
Yes.
In Daniel 9. And if you remember, we like Jeremiah chapter 29. We like it. We cite it so many times, but we cite only that part where it says, I know the plans that I have for you.
And we universalize
good plans. Plans for you to prosper, and so on. And is it possible that Daniel has read that chapter about the 70 years that is just above that promise?
He had to.
Yes, and that is why he prayed. And then he receives the message that the 70 years are going to be over. People are going to go home. So what happens to that promise? My plans, says God, are good for you, better than you can ever imagine. And now here they are going to experience trouble. So heavy trouble.
And by the way, it's interesting how we universalize that promise in Jeremiah, which actually could have been focused on. But so let's look at the flow of this chapter. It begins where?
Well,
I mean, it's fairly clear in the beginning, right? It begins with Persians. And so I don't think there's much dispute about where the chapter begins. Right?
It is interesting, though. I mean, I'm fascinated by, as the lesson pointed out too, that this Greek king, the wealthy one, is typically identified as Xerxes. And so Xerxes, of course, remember, is, or Ahasuerus is his other name, but this is the king who we meet in the book of Esther. So the connections, biblical connections with history are fascinating.
And is there a lot of debate about the beginning of this chapter, who the people are? Like Alexander the Great is often identified.
He is identified with the mighty king who arises.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And then it's broken in four. So you see some parallels between here and the one in chapter 8, right?
Yeah, the division of Alexander's kingdom. Four quarters of the earth.
And of course, everybody will want to know then who is the king of the north and the south.
Well, before we get there, actually, when I was reading this, and to go back to our question on why Daniel was confused, I was confused. we don't have any beasts or animals in this chapter, and I was confused. But the verses that gave me hope were the end of verse 24, when it talked about, he shall devise plans against strongholds, but only for a time. And verse 27, the end is yet to be at an appointed time. So to me, the good news I took there, and also at the end of verse 35, it still waits the appointed time. That the ups and downs of history are only for a short time. It's all moving on a linear track towards a greater event. And that gives me hope that even amidst the uncertainty of our time right now, it's only for a time.
Yeah.
Yes, the expressions about time in Daniel are interesting. There is the time, even in chapter 2, in Daniel 2, where Nebuchadnezzar has the dream.
Yeah.
In chapter 4, where Nebuchadnezzar has the dream of the tree, and then turns into a beastly creature. The idea of time is present. It is either a time that is flowing, and that is going like we see from day to day, week to week, month to month. But then there is an appointed time. It's a time that is determined, a time that is decreed.
Yeah. So you certainly see the fact that the God of heaven has his hand in history.
Yes.
He has his hand in the business of humans. Yeah. So how do we make progress through here? Because this. I've even read how the Russians and Israel are implicated here, and Muslims and all kinds of things. So it seems to me that when you begin this chapter, it's fairly easy to identify historical figures. But the more you progress into it, the more difficult it becomes. Am I correct?
I think so. Yes.
And I'll tell you what my thought is. I think that the way I look at this, especially the ending, is think about where it ends, because it finally ties off in chapter 12, verse 1, which is not our chapter for today, but you see that at that time there is a signal event where Michael the prince stands up and everything comes to a screeching halt, right? So I wonder if you follow the progression in the rest of Daniel, if this is not language that finally gets lost in almost symbolic ways, to represent not just historical figures, but the cosmic conflict. That's the way I look at this chapter, and I don't try to identify all the people in this chapter, because I think the language becomes, I don't know what word to use, representative of the conflict. And we see this in other places. For example, we talk about the king of Tyre, and use him as a representative of Lucifer, the king of Babylon, that way too. Babylon, the city, becomes representative of evil, versus Jerusalem becomes... And I wonder if that idea doesn't fit this chapter and help us a little bit. It doesn't... Maybe we're not supposed to be able to identify all the people in this chapter. What do you think? I don't know.
Well, I think I guess the question would be, are there some anchors for us? And I think traditionally, in Daniel 11, verse 22, you have a reference to the Prince of the Covenant. And I think that's the same terminology before when we go back to Daniel chapter 9, in which it usually identifies with Jesus being the Prince of the Covenant. So things like that. And then also in chapter 11, verse 29 through 35, the attack on the temple and on the regular burnt offering seems to point back to the book of Daniel, when it talks about the host of heaven being cast down. So it seems like this process of recapitulation, where it says in one chapter and then it picks and expands on it. It seems like that is working throughout here. Yeah. Yet, even among scholars who would view it that way, they don't always draw the lines in the same places or interpret them in the same way.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think, though, that the further you get down this here, like when you get down to verse 40, what do you do there?
Well, this is where it's interesting because, there are different viewpoints in at least Adventist tradition. So in verse 40, they typically assume that the king of the north is the papacy, and the king of the south gets identified as atheism or communist power, and how communism and godless mentality is pushed back at the end. But then the king of the north comes against God's people.
Yeah.
But then I've seen also, more recently, you mentioned some of those Adventists too that actually identify this with actual physical battle that's going to take place in the Middle East today.
Yeah.
Which some people get excited about because that's it's sensational enough, but I'm not sure I'm quite convinced on the hermeneutical grounds of that interpretation.
Yeah.
I feel there are, of course, like you mentioned at the beginning, so many different ways of identifying the king of the north, the king of the south, and if we focus on a specific on specific events that happen in our history, like you mentioned, Islam or communism and so on. That is when we are going to always have to revise our reading of these 2000 something old text, and that is one of the ways that is so insecure to me. So I rather stay with the words in the biblical text and let them take on draw out.
So what do you read there, Matilda? What do you find when you look at the text?
Sometimes you do find a lot with phrases and words where they are used in different ways. Sometimes they are so few or even unique that you do not have anything to attach it on. So in those places, I think cautiousness is best.
Yeah. And there have been many examples in history where people have tried to identify something from their era and attach it to a text.
Right.
And it seems to be that we should be taking the text and attaching it to something else, not the other way around. But to me, the most comforting thing about this is that, and this is true of all eschatology, the big picture is very clear. That God is at work in history, and He's going to redeem a people from this broken earth and transport them into a world made new. In fact, I was talking to a class just the other day that the story of the Bible as a whole is a fascinating one, because it begins with a story that takes a world that's chaotic, without form and void, and through a very nice story you end up with an orderly paradise. And then comes the tragedy of chapter 3 in Genesis, where everything is ruined, and there follows this long story of the ups and downs of history where God does not walk away from the problem. He enters into it in multiple ways. In fact, I think one of the great truths of the sanctuary doctrine is that God did not walk away from sin. And He said, when you have a problem with sin, don't leave me, come to me, because I have my own temple here. I'm not going away from it, so you come and see me. Don't run away, and I have a solution. The same is true of the coming of Jesus to Bethlehem, that God enters into history and says, don't run away from me, I have a solution. Well, you progress then to the end of Revelation, where the story devolves again to a world of chaos. We've talked about how the bottomless pit has links almost to the Genesis story about without form and void. It's chaotic again. And then God, at the very end, he starts over again. He says, I'm going to make a new heaven and a new earth. But the story of the Bible is that some of the people who have come from this broken world will be transported to the new world. So I think the big picture of eschatology is very clear. The details are where we get bogged down.
Yes.
And I find myself very comforted by the big picture. And I like your cautionary word, Matilda, that I don't think we should try to identify everybody and every player in the controversy, because I think there is something to be said for the dynamics of the circumstance.
I like to connect it. For example, when Jesus tells parables, when we try to explain every detail in the parable in the Gospels, we will get lost, and we will not understand the key message that the parable wants to convey. Yeah. So the details in parables are not what Jesus was paying attention to. It was the nucleus, the focus in the parable that conveys the message. And in these chapters in Daniel that have been understood by many Bible scholars as the apocalyptic style of ancient Jewish literature, especially when the Jewish people suffered and were under heavy oppression, like in Babylon and afterwards. These kind of visions that speak of beasts first, and now we come to these regions that are here explained, north and south. I think in those cases it is best to keep track of what happened there in the big picture of the story.
And I think that we need a degree of humility.
Yes.
Which means that I don't think it prohibits us from saying, well, how could this apply? How could I see this? So I don't think it's necessarily wrong to say, well, I see it this way. Yet we do need to be sensitive, particularly to different regions of the world that we are working in, so we don't bring undue persecution upon ourselves for the ideology we'd be pushing, but to be humble and to be searching about how to apply this.
Yeah.
I was looking for the King of the South. So I looked up that terminology in the biblical text. The way it is used, the way it appears here, it's only here in this chapter, in that way, King of the South. It is in the Hebrew language the King of the Negev.
Oh, the desert.
The desert. That's the word used for the south. So if you find it a few other times in the biblical text, and one that was interesting to me, you can go back to Numbers chapter 21. The Israelites are in the desert wandering, passing through the desert to go to the promised land. In chapter 21, the Canaanite king of Arad, who lived in the south, in the Negev. So there is a king of the south, basically. When he heard that Israel was coming along the road to Atarim, he attacked the Israelites and captured some of them. Don't you think it's interesting? I found it interesting. There is a king of the south. He hears about these people of God coming, and he fights and he captures. He takes them captives. That draws us automatically into Daniel's world, where Daniel's people, when Daniel, are captured.
Yeah, on a larger scale than that. Yeah.
Yes. So an actual historical king of the south, of the Negev, who had this power, and then they were fighting. And now we come into Daniel 11, where we have a king of the south who is in a constant battle. Yeah. And in the middle of this battle are God's people.
And of course that becomes representative of the whole great controversy between good and evil.
And then the king of the north is used a lot more throughout the biblical text. And in most places, or in many places, it directly actually in Ezekiel, and Ezekiel is in Babylon too, and he directly describes the king of the north as Nebuchadnezzar. Yeah. And the attacks that Israel suffered always came from the north, and these are come from Babylon, which is actually on the other side of the desert, but he comes from the north.
Yeah, comes around the Fertile Crescent. Yes. Yeah, that's interesting. And of course, east is the place of deliverance, right?
Yes.
You can escape to the east.
And that will then appear in our chapter pretty much at the end, right? Yes. There are rumors coming from the east.
And that reminded me too, you just referred to it, but Jeremiah chapter 1, right? He has this vision of this boiling pot.
Yes.
And it's it's coming, the disaster is coming from the north. So for someone, Daniel, I mean, he would know the pressure from the north, the pressure from the south, and God's people getting kind of squished in the middle.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, and I think there's also a theological reason that's worth thinking about here, is that if God is a God of love, as he's spoken of in the Bible, then the whole question of the ability to choose becomes a critical component in people's journey with God, because love cannot be required. And I've been thinking about this recently, that if God is a God of love, then the capacity of other beings to choose has got to be real. It cannot be only apparent. And I think that means that the dynamic that we talk about here, where the people of God are caught between the north and the south, that their ability to choose freely for God becomes infringed upon, and I think that becomes the occasion where God acts, when that liberty becomes too infringed upon. God acts. I personally think that the time of trouble that is spoken of in the Bible, that prior to the coming of Jesus, is going to have that same dynamic. That when the liberties of people to live by conscience is infringed upon globally, I think that my own opinion is that God will act and say no more of that, enough of that. So.
And I wonder if it just, I think in many ways in North America we've been kind of at an arm's distance from that. We've had the privilege of religious liberty, but it is just interesting in the last few weeks how things can change so rapidly. I mean, you think, the power of the state. How could you lock down all of California?
Although I talked to somebody in California, said that's kind of misunderstood.
But it's still the point is that our own state would be able to intervene in the lives of people to impose restrictions.
Although I don't see them infringing on religious freedom.
No,
I tell you, you can't gather, but this is for.
But I think it illustrates the point.
Yeah, how fragile liberty is.
Liberty really is, and we don't know what the future holds for us.
Yeah.
Yes.
But it does sound to me. Would you agree, Dave and Matilda, that kind of the key verses are these last 5 verses in Daniel chapter 11, right?
Well, they lead to a climax.
Mm-hmm.
I think there is there happens a change throughout the chapter. You have the first few verses that you can root easily into the history of the Persian and the Greeks, but then the style changes into words and phrases that have allusions to other places, like the chapter 8 in Daniel, with the abomination that causes desolation, and the tamid, the daily that is destroyed, and so on. And then you come to verses 40 to 45, which again take us probably a step further into that cosmic battle that I think I like.
And it uses the phrase "the time of the end."
Yes.
Which is now a much more specific phrase, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And the glorious land would be then it would refer to Israel in a literal sense, but here probably metaphorical, right? To God's people. Is that how you'd understand that?
I like what Jacques Toucan in this book on Daniel writes about that, the secrets of Daniel, where he explains that the beautiful land, a reference to Israel, Palestine, but it is not the geography referred to. It is because the temple is that connection that is the center of this place. And it is the connection to the presence of God.
So where the presence of God is, that's the beautiful.
So it's talking more of an ethos than it is a geographic location. Yes. So. Yeah, and then it winds down, and even though some specific places are mentioned, Egypt, Libyans, Ethiopians, Edom, Moab, Ammon, but those I think become representative phrases. I don't know.
Yes, that is again one of those places I think where in this kind of writing and this kind of vision where he uses actual people groups, actual locations, but uses them to speak of something that is far beyond, something greater than Ammon and Moab. Ammon and Moab, who are the incestuous children of Lot. And here they are going to be taken care of. Right?
Yeah, and that's the struggle with apocalyptic.
They will be delivered.
How do you translate the things that had geographical significance in history to represent something cosmic? That's where the struggle comes.
Yes.
But it says he will come to an end, and no one will help him.
And that's the good news of this chapter, right?
Yeah,
It's the good news. And we find the answer to that, of course, how that end plays out in chapter 12.
Which we're not allowed to speak about.
We're not allowed to speak about, which is interesting because these chapter divisions, of course, are not original.
No.
So it's artificial for us to want to come to an end with verse 45.
So what else do we need to say here? Or can we just rest comfortably with the idea that the cosmic picture of eschatology is very clear, and in Revelation it's clear. It begins on earth and ends with the recreation of the world. The biblical picture is clear, and so I content myself. I don't sleep at night worrying about not being able to understand all these words. But I like what you say about the progression from the Persian Empire, but it seems to step into more cosmic zone. So, any final comments from either one of you?
I think it just is a word of encouragement amidst the confusion of chapter 12 is, it just reminds me that the
You mean
Bible,
chapter 11?
Chapter 11,
Yeah.
yeah. It just reminds me that the Bible is a book that's very deep, and that the opportunity for study and understand and to grow, but always with a heavy dose of humility, which is something that we all struggle with. But that to me just is an encouragement. But I do like the big general picture that we talked about. That's an encouragement. And
Yeah, because that's not in doubt. That's, we might not get all the pieces figured out, but the big picture is very clear, and God is. And I think it's also very clear that from the biblical perspective, the history behind us is much longer than the history ahead of us.
you think is there a danger, because this is a controversial passage?
Yeah.
There's many controversial passages in Scripture. What would be the danger, if you see any dangers, of having a firm conviction that this is Islam or this is the papacy? Are there dangers associated with that, or?
I don't know. You want to comment on that, Matilda? I have a comment, but.
I think a strong conviction about something that happens in our lifetimes probably is something that we go through, we experience it. So it touches our lives maybe directly, and for that reason it has great importance. And what if Daniel experienced it in that same way for himself in his time? But the text is more than our 70 or 80 years of lifetime, right?
Yeah.
So it needs to have meaning to people who were before us and to people who come after, if that time comes and lasts. So we recognize that events of world history change. Like Daniel said, kingdoms come and fall. And the one constant that is there is God, who works behind the scenes, even when we don't recognize it.
You see, I'm thinking about, for example, there was a time when the Lisbon earthquake, Carl, was the earthquake that was going to be the one before Jesus came. And the eschatology people were very invested in that. And I think the Bible as a document as a whole is a document that is sufficient to sustain faith, but it's not exhaustive. And some people get very upset over that. They think, no, the Bible is not exhaustive, and it admits that. John himself said that Jesus did many other things that are not written down. That the Bible does not answer everything about history, but it gives us a very clear big picture of what God is doing that's sufficient to sustain faith. And so I think that when we become hyper-focused on something or convinced that is the one and only, we should be a little more humble, because history has humbled a lot of people in terms of their opinions.
I thought maybe also we could think back of the Jewish religious authorities of Jesus' day who were pretty certain they had figured out the truth about the Messiah.
Oh, yeah.
And they were so certain that they didn't recognize what God was doing in their own day and age. And so perhaps maybe we would also need some humility when it comes to
and I think there's a certain value to the tension that comes into life from the unknown. You know, that I worry if people get their chronology, the eschatological chronology, all tightly laid out, then they tend to think, we still got, we got another 5 years before Jesus comes. We still have these events have to take place, and the doctrine itself is in tension. In some instances, says you might not get home today because Jesus will come like a thief in the night, and others say, well, you should buy your homes and have children, and so this tension. It keeps us unsettled in our existence. I think the signs of the times are the same thing, and this whole coronavirus thing has created a massive unsettling of human self-sufficiency. People are afraid. What now? I've even read articles in the secular press, is God angry with us? I mean, that's not a picture of God that I would like to portray, but the confidence that we develop from our own opinions needs to be unsettled. There should always be a longing in our heart for the kingdom, and always a sense of uncertainty that we don't know when it's coming. So,
Well said.
the one keeps a longing in the heart, the other one keeps us from being fully invested in life on planet Earth. So,
I think the events that we're going through today is an opportunity for us to recognize what really matters in life,
Yeah.
what's really important,
Yeah.
and to put our priorities in the right place. So,
you know, you just triggered a story in my mind. When my parents were in Beirut when the war broke out, my father and mother were working there, and my father used to tell
this
how.
would be what time frame?
Oh, this was back in the early 80s,
Okay.
late 70s, whenever the Civil War broke out. And, you know, my mother doesn't like the cold. And so on one of the trips to church headquarters in Washington, D.C., my dad had spent $700 on some carpeting that he had shipped to cover the tile floor in the house. It wasn't laid down but it was rolled out, and it was a lovely feature. And he said that when the bullets started flying, they grabbed two things: their Bibles and a few books and the pictures on the wall, and they fled to the bomb shelter in the basement. And when he got down there, he chuckled about this, all the work he had done to get this. And now he said it was absolutely meaningless. And you know, I think that's been a lesson to me, that don't
Great
be
story.
too attached to the things of this earth. The big picture is clear. God is at work in a cosmic conflict between good and evil, and the good side is going to win.
I think that's a good place to wrap up today's lesson. I want to thank Dave and Matilda for joining us, and for you also for joining us. We'll be back next week looking at the last chapter of Daniel chapter 12, and Professor Brant Berglund will be our teacher. So stay well, stay safe, and take care. God bless. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye bye.